Hello and welcome to today's KraneShares webinar. Trump or Biden? Two former U.S. ambassadors discuss the election and its likely impact on U.S.-China relations. My name is Brendan Ahern. I am the Chief Investment Officer of KraneShares Exchange-Traded Funds. Chinese equity markets have had a strong rally since bottoming in January of this year. From the end of January through yesterday's close in U.S. dollar terms, the Shanghai and Shenzhen composite indices have returned 8.75 and 8.38%. The returns of Hong Kong listed stocks have been even stronger, with the Hang Seng Index and the growth-oriented Hang Seng Tech Index returning 20% and 26% versus the S&P 500's 11% and NASDAQ 100's 11.24% return. And yet many investors remain on the sidelines. Despite China's GDP in the first quarter beating expectations and corporate earnings rebounding, many investors cite the upcoming November U.S. presidential election, the potential for an increase in campaign rhetoric, and potential uncertainty on second-term economic policies as reasons for not participating in this China rally. In order to help investors discern campaign rhetoric from potential policy, we have two distinguished political insiders, both having served for recent Republican and Democratic presidents. Terry Branstad is the longest-running governor in the history of the United States, having served his native Iowa as governor from 1983 to 1999, and again from 2011 to 2017. Terry, who actually met President Xi during a 1980s agricultural trip to Iowa, served as the U.S. ambassador to China under President Trump. And it's certainly great to see and to have Terry here joining us today. Also joining us is David Adelman, KraneShares General Counsel, who served as the 15th U.S. ambassador to Singapore during the first term of President Obama after working as a managing director for Goldman Sachs in Hong Kong. Over the course of today's presentation, please feel free to ask questions. You can do so if you're joining us on KraneShares.com by emailing us at info@KraneShares.com. And for those of you joining us on Zoom, please use the chat button. For continuing education credits, please email us at ce@KraneShares.com. Now, I really want to get into this, but I'm just going to provide a very quick overview for some of you who are less familiar about KraneShares. So our founder, Jonathan Crane, formed two core beliefs during his experience living and building a successful business in China. These two core beliefs were the foundation for KraneShares way back in 2012. The first was that new China sectors such as domestic consumption, internet, e-commerce, semiconductors, clean technology, and healthcare have become the new drivers of China's economic growth, though those sectors are still underallocated in global portfolios. The second thesis was the opening of China's mainland equity markets, the second largest in the world, would have a significant effect on investors' portfolios as those markets were included into global indices. Most importantly, we endeavor to earn the trust of investors through our balanced, data-driven perspective on China's economy and capital markets. China's continued rise in market indices, along with its significant economic effect on the global economy, necessitate investors have a partner to navigate these developments that KraneShares endeavors to earn that partnership role. We maintain a daily research blog that is available at ChinaLastNight.com, which we encourage you to subscribe to in order to keep abreast of new developments as they occur. So with that, let's dive right in. It's just so great to have the two of you here. I was just in Hong Kong and Asia last week, and I think one of the major pushbacks that I received, despite this rally in Chinese equities on both an absolute and relative basis, was the continued geopolitical rhetoric. And I thought it might be helpful to start to talk a little bit about maybe what past, we have these two candidates, President Biden President Trump, in this campaign, and maybe be worthwhile to take a quick look at what their past policies were. Maybe we'll start with you, Terry, just since President Trump is, also again running for re-election here, but we saw his past policies, which including implementing some tariffs on China, but he actually did a deal with China. So love to get your insights on being President Trump's man in Beijing.
Well, thank you. Good day and ni hao. I appreciate the opportunity to be on this panel, and I want you to know it was quite an experience to be the American ambassador in Beijing, China. We went through the so-called trade war mainly because President Trump wanted to make sure that America got a better deal. And eventually, and it was a long and tough battle, and I want to give Ambassador Lighthizer credit. He was the lead person on the American side. He worked with Liu He on the Chinese side, and we reached the phase 1 trade agreement, which was, I think, a very good agreement. Not perfect. A lot of issues were resolved, but it dramatically increased American exports, especially of agricultural products. And it's made a real difference in terms of farm income in the state of Iowa and other Midwestern states. So with regard to the situation, I think Trump is a business person, and he's basically interested in improving the income of American business and American workers in particular. So if he can work out a deal with China that he thinks really is beneficial to American workers, including, say, Chinese investments in America that creates good jobs here, I think that's something that he would agree to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Certainly he has a reputation of having his careers in the business world, and he did a deal. I mean, without question.
Yeah, unfortunately, right after the phase 1 agreement was agreed upon, we had COVID, and COVID and the worldwide pandemic obviously had some impact. But even despite that, we did see record exports, especially of agricultural goods, and that's something that farmers and rural people appreciate. So he's got a strong base of support in rural America.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Now, David, I think one of the expectations was that President Biden, kind of more of a career diplomat, a career politician, was going to go soft on China, and that's certainly not been the case. I think there's arguments he's maybe even been a little bit tougher, been tougher on China than President Trump.
Yeah, thanks, Brendan and Ambassador Branstad. Delighted to be with you again today. Thank you for your friendship with KraneShares. I think the evening before the general election, almost 4 years ago today, I published a piece in the South China Morning Post where I wasn't taking much risk in projecting that the election would be very close. And concluding that American policy towards China would likely be very similar should Biden defeat the then incumbent Donald Trump. What I said in my piece is the primary difference would be in tone, that Biden would likely be more conciliatory than Trump had been in his first term. I'm thinking to myself, I could probably write the same piece this year. I think that President Biden's policies in this first term, as it relates to China, have been very comparable, very similar to those from the first Trump term. There's been perhaps the heaviest use of tariffs on trade of goods that we've seen in generations. That has continued, different from what some had predicted. Biden did not roll back the so-called Trump tariffs, so in effect, the trade tension continued. Indeed, as you may have been alluding to, Brendan, in some cases, Biden increased the rates of tariffs, most notably just in the last 2 weeks, putting forward and signing an executive order that put in place very strong 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, in effect, completely protecting the U.S. market from China's enormous electric vehicle production capacity. So I think it's interesting that the policies continued, but what is equally as interesting is that the two-way trade of goods has continued. The numbers that were recently published show that, year on year, the May U.S.-China trade in goods numbers are remaining consistent. Last year, for 2023, I think the total number of two-way trade of goods was in excess of $580 billion. The imbalance has remained pretty constant. So the Chinese economy and the American economy continue to grow. Trade in goods and services continue to increase or at least remain steady, despite some of the changes in regulations and the imposition of tariffs. The conclusion, I think, should be that over the last 8 years, despite political interests in protectionism in both Beijing and in Washington, American businesses and Chinese businesses have found a way to continue to trade goods, trade services, and increasingly capital flows are returning to pre-COVID levels as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I find it interesting that you have this political bark, but yet business people still get along really, really well and able to do business with one another. And you think about all the U.S. corporate executives who have been visiting China very frequently because of the very, very high revenue. I've read that it's almost 400 billion of revenues from U.S. multinationals in China. That obviously that doesn't get included in trade because, unlike pork and soybeans, Terry, it's not put on a boat. But maybe you could, from the President Trump's his time in office, it felt like he wanted to do this deal, and yet he was very pro-business in China. And I think your native Iowans were certainly beneficiaries of Trump's kind of pro-trade policies with China. I mean, there's a lot of negotiating the deal, but he certainly wanted to push those American interests in China.
Well, there's no doubt about that. And of course, Iowa farmers in particular, but Iowans generally recognize the importance. We are a state that has some of the best land in the world, and we produce great agriculture products. And obviously, we need international markets for it, not just China, but all over the world. So that's critically important. And China is a big country, and with a growing middle class, more demand for protein, it's critically important. I think they raise more. We are the leading pork producing state in America, but China raises more pork than any other country in the world. And of course, the ingredients that go into raising pigs is corn and soybeans. So those are natural for us, and it's something that we're important. And we've been working for at least 3 decades to build the relationship with the purchasers there in China. And so it's critically important to try to maintain that. And I think that's going to be critically important. I think another area is energy. And I think the reason why Biden just recently put the 100% tax on electric vehicles, I think he made a huge mistake in focusing and in trying to mandate electric vehicles in the United States. American consumers want a choice. They don't want to be mandated to electric vehicles. China has a huge advantage there. They have access to the rare earth minerals, and they can produce electric vehicles at a lot less cost than we can. And frankly, in America, especially here in the Midwest, we've been focusing on things like ethanol, biodiesel, and things like that. And in fact, now we're working on sequestering carbon dioxide so we can have a product that is better for the environment than electric vehicles. And that's the only way I think we succeed in competing with China. And so I think Biden was starting to hear the concern that he was going to make us dependent on China for electric vehicles. And that's why the extraordinary tariff now on Chinese electric vehicles. But I really think his policy was a big mistake. And I think that the Trump campaign is going to try to really focus on that. I'm really excited about the possibility of Governor Doug Burgum being the vice presidential candidate. He was very successful in high-tech company, made a lot of money, then became the governor of North Dakota. And of course, he's been a real leader in energy in North Dakota, both with traditional energy, of course, using fracking to get petroleum, but also in renewables. And so that's a thing that we think would be exciting if he would be on the ticket. And I've gotten to know him quite well. He did enter the presidential caucus and spent some time in Iowa. So he's made some friends here. Obviously, he's not very well known because he's from a very small state. But I'm excited about the fact that he's one of the finalists being considered for vice president. And usually the vice presidential choice doesn't make a lot of difference, but somebody with his experience, knowledge, and expertise, I think could be helpful to the Trump ticket.
Brendan, the electric vehicle conversation is an interesting one because, you know, there's the law of unintended consequences. And I think putting these very high barriers in place, prohibiting Chinese electric vehicles from import into the United States may have the unintended consequence, I think, of giving China an advantage in other markets. I was recently traveling in the Middle East and just eyeballing it. The Chinese EVs are everywhere. I know that's also the case in the Americas. So, you know, China's a very formidable electric vehicle manufacturing ecosystem is going to be pursuing global markets. The American market is important, but it's not the only one.
Yeah, well, and certainly we're probably in the
rumors
EU.
are that the Chinese will also actually build their electric vehicles in Mexico and use that as an opportunity.
There's already plants producing vehicles and you know, taking advantage of the benefit of NAFTA and its predecessors and other follow-on policies. But I expect you know, Mexico and Canada to participate in some of the protectionism along with the United States. But I think the untold story, the unintended consequence, may very well be China's domination of the electric vehicle markets in Europe, the Americas, and the Middle East.
Yeah.
I think there's no doubt they're going to dominate worldwide. The question is, can we compete with them with ethanol and biodiesel and sequestering the carbon dioxide so that we can make that environmentally equal or even better than the electric vehicles, and not having the problems we saw last winter, the problems with electric vehicles freezing up because of the weather. If it's too hot or too cold, there's real problems. There's also problems with traveling significant distance. So it's not gone over very well with the American consumer.
Well, and certainly, we anticipate an element of campaign rhetoric will be geared to these 8 swing states that are really what the election is all about, and certainly for Michigan and Wisconsin, which are very involved in the automotive. Biden was probably playing to those potential voters, and I think that's in general an important area where Terry, probably no one knows better about running for re-election than yourself, Terry.
I was
and-
elected 6 times. I have the all-time record in
Yeah.
terms of length of service. But I think it's really important to stay in touch with the constituents. And that's where I think Biden's at a disadvantage, because his electric vehicle mandate is not popular with the consumers. And I think it could hurt him. And especially that's why I really think if Burgum were the vice presidential candidate, with his knowledge of these issues, especially energy, I think it could be very helpful to Trump.
Yeah. And how should we distinguish what's being said on the campaign trail versus what could actually be economic reality? That my kind of maybe jaded view is you're going to say whatever it takes to get elected, but that's not necessarily what could end up being policy. And I think in Asia, people are used to political leaders, when they say something, they mean it and it gets done. But on the campaign trail, I think it's whatever it takes to get reelected, but then it might not actually come into reality. And just how should we think about what Trump and Biden, what are they going to be saying on the campaign trail to get reelected versus what they might actually implement?
Well, the fact is that our systems are very different. If Xi Jinping says he wants to do something, he has the power to do it. Here we have the Congress, and then you have the courts, and we oftentimes, as we do now, have a divided Congress where even though the president wants to do something, it's not going to be able to be approved necessarily just as he proposes. It's interesting. Recently, Trump was in Nevada and said he wants to eliminate the tax on tips. I think that's a very popular suggestion, and there's a lot of cheating on tips, and consequently, it's going to be interesting. But he's also had to clarify that this would be a recommendation, would have to be approved by the Congress.
And that's one of those 8 swing states that's really crucial. And
it is. And in Nevada, he is ahead, I think, by 5 points, which they say is within the margin of error, but that's a significant improvement for him. From what I've been hearing is Trump is doing a lot better in Arizona and Nevada and Georgia, and consequently, Biden has to win Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin all. If he loses any one of them, he loses. But again, a lot can happen between now and election day, and it's a very volatile year. But it's amazing how, for the last several months, the polls have been about the same.
Yep. And
Brendan, the point you're making is such an important one, which is for investors, the ability to separate the rhetoric from the actions and the impact. And I think what we'll see over the next 3 months is, very hot rhetoric, not just towards China, but, China sort of near or at the top of the list. We're going to hear a lot of very, very hawkish speeches, hawkish comments, hawkish advertising from both President Trump and President Biden. But I have to say that I think, regardless of the outcome, and it'll be a close election, we can expect both, or either, I should say, either candidate in a second term. And it's this extraordinary situation we have where, regardless of the outcome, it's going to be a second presidential term to look for a deal. And that's where I think the candidates or the second term presidents will be very different. I think Donald Trump, throughout his entire career, has held himself out as a big deal maker. And I think he'll be quickly looking for a big deal with China, maybe a follow-on from the phase 1 trade deal, maybe a deal that sort of includes Russia on geopolitical and security issues as it relates to the war in Europe and Ukraine. And I think Biden is less so of a grand deal maker. It will be more tactical, if you will. He will compartmentalize issues, probably deal with trade separately from some of the security issues. What's interesting is both men, regardless of the outcome, will have to deal with the two issues that are driving American policy relating to China today. And that is China's friendship without limits, if you will, with Russia, and how that is impacting NATO and the war in Ukraine. And second, China's enormous manufacturing and production capacity, and how that'll affect global markets, for example, with regard to solar panels or electric vehicles, as we've already discussed, or the very tricky security issue around very high-end semiconductors. It's interesting because 4 years ago and 8 years ago and even 12 years ago, there were three security issues on the agenda: Taiwan, the Korean Peninsula, and the South China Sea. In many ways, while those are all remain important security issues, they've kind of been preempted by the China-Russia cooperation and the increased manufacturing capacity in China and the impact that's had on American manufacturing capacity, American jobs, and American markets.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then I think the kind of Biden small yard with high fence is that kind of trying to ring fence some of the high-end U.S. semiconductors. Really not seeing that policy expanded to other areas. A lot of U.S. businesses doing a lot of business in China, really navigating some of the diplomatic noise. But is that kind of your anticipation for a Biden second term, David?
I think that's right. Look, the export control regime, which you reference, has remained stable, pretty. I'll just say similar, not the same, similar over these 8 years, over both the Trump first term and the Biden first term, and I expect it to be the same. By many experts, in many experts' opinions, the ring fencing, if you will, the higher fences around the jewels, has had, again, the unintended consequence of spurring on China's determination to develop its own semiconductor capacity at the high end. But as you've said, I think American businesses or global businesses have worked around the export controls, and it does not seem to, at least as of yet, materially impacted China's ability to manufacture goods for global demand. I would add to that it continues to be a pillar of China's economic policy to promote domestic consumerism. And that we can expect that to continue regardless of the outcome of the American presidential election. So it's probably going to be a steady rate of growth for Chinese manufacturing, regardless of the outcome of the American election. And in fact, I think if a second-term presidency, whether it be Biden or Trump, follows the historic patterns, we will see the American president trying to make his mark on the world before he exits the world stage and look for a deal, which I think can only result in easing of trade tensions and perhaps bolstering a return to a global economy where the two largest economies depend on each other, and that interdependence should favor both China and the United States. I'm not projecting a return to sort of the free trade days of the late 90s or early 2000s, but I think this strategic competition, as the Biden team has described it, will promote markets and promote industrial capacity in both countries.
I think obviously it takes two to tango.
Exactly.
On the other side, I know you both were in San Francisco for the APAC meetings where President Xi came to the United States and met with President Biden. And, we've seen a little bit of a change in the tone and tenor from the China side. We've arguably seen some call it green shoots on stabilizing the relationship. And particularly from the China side, I would argue, these subtle signs of panda diplomacy, the military's meeting, continued diplomatic dialogue at a high level between the two countries. But maybe from both of your being in San Francisco, what are your maybe anticipation for how would China react to a Trump second term, their willingness maybe to do another deal, and then maybe after Terry, David, you can kind of give maybe the Biden perspective of how will they reciprocate some of the softer tone and tenor that we're seeing from the China diplomatically.
Well, there's no question, having been in San Francisco for the dinner that they had with a lot of the American business leaders, it's clear that Xi Jinping is on a charm offensive. And I think he realizes that he needs American businesses to invest in China. He wants that. And I think they've toned down the rhetoric in order to try to accomplish more of that. On the American side, I think if Trump is elected again, he will choose Lighthizer to be, he and Lighthizer have a good relationship. I gained a lot of respect for Lighthizer. I was not so sure about him when I became ambassador, but as we went through the process and I saw the relationship he developed with Liu He, the key negotiator on the Chinese side, which led to the phase 1 trade agreement, I would not be surprised if he would again ask Lighthizer to be his trade negotiator and to try to get another deal, which could hopefully be an improvement over what the phase 1 agreement was.
Yep. And is that part of the really strong rhetoric that, this is part of the art of the deal, threatening 60% tariffs? I mean, to me, that's almost like a Smoot-Hawley-like moment, but it'd be really a disaster for Home Depot and Amazon and Costco and Walmart. But to me, it's more, I'm naive in thinking that that's just part of the negotiating tactic.
Yes, I think it is. I think realistically, that's probably a lot more than is likely to happen. But I think it's part of the negotiations that Trump looks at needs to occur in order to get the best deal.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the way I view it. I think there's a number of things. Obviously, like I say, I think if you chose Doug Burgum to be the vice presidential candidate, and with his knowledge of high tech and energy, that could be an asset as well. So I think a lot of what will happen in a second term depends on the people that you choose. And one of the things that I think is an asset for Trump is he did a lot of deregulation, which helped American companies to succeed and helped improve income for American workers. And on Biden, we see it go the other way with a lot more regulations and mandates that businesses don't like. And consequently, I think that'll be another issue. It's more of a domestic issue, but it does impact our relationship with China and other countries.
And Brendan, back to APEC in November in San Francisco, because I think this is important. The hope in both Beijing and Washington was that the summit, the Xi-Biden summit in November of last year, would at a minimum establish a floor, create a stable floor under U.S.-China relations. And there were 3 agreements. One on fentanyl, which was very important to Biden, and China has delivered, curbing the flow of the fentanyl precursors to the United States from China. 2 on student exchanges, which was very important to President Xi. The programming is beginning. There's a little more lead time in sending American students over to China at sort of pre-COVID or even 2009, 2010 levels. And 3, and most importantly, I think, is a resumption of military to military communication at the highest level. And just in the last month, I believe, or 3 weeks, America's Secretary of Defense and Chinese Minister of Defense met at the Shangri-La Dialogue. in Singapore. I think it's the first in-person meeting at the cabinet level in many years. And I think both Beijing and Washington agree that that solid, stable floor under U.S.-China relations that was hoped for coming out of what the Chinese are calling the San Francisco consensus, in fact, is held and is in place, and is something that a second-term Biden or a second-term Trump can build on. I think investors should find comfort in that floor under U.S.-China relations, and that comfort, I think, should be increased by the fact that traditionally second terms for U.S. presidents focus on international relations and focus on high-level deal-making. In a completely separate context, I can't help but think of President Clinton in the very final days of his presidency trying to pull together the Oslo Accord so that he could make his mark on international relations. I hope U.S.-China relations aren't involved in that kind of brinksmanship at the very end of a second term, but rather whether it be Trump or Biden, Biden's second term, they roll up their sleeves and get to work on a deal across the Pacific.
And just with the level of economic interdependence, how much does that corporate perspective that actually play in the White House? I mean, are they receiving that feedback from the corporate world, where you would think a Tim Cook or Elon Musk or and any number of U.S. multinationals, from ExxonMobil to Nike to Boeing? I mean, does that corporate voice, does it have sway, or does it get a proverbial at bat in a White House, maybe from a Biden and Trump perspective? Maybe David, from a Biden perspective.
Yeah, look, I mean, it's a very good point. I think culturally, in a second term, in the executive, in a president's administration, it takes the pressure off. You're no longer running for re-election, and you can focus on policies that, as I previously mentioned, allow a president to make his mark on international relations, but also take a longer view. And yeah, sure, corporate leaders from a civil society will have, I think, more of an audience in a White House, whether it be a Trump or Biden White House in a second term, because the pressure of a re-election campaign has been taken off. I have to say, though, in both the Trump first term and the Biden first term, American corporate leaders, seem to have a lot of access to the decision makers, and maybe more importantly, I think that American corporate leaders seem to have a strong voice in Beijing. And Terry referred to the President Xi's dinner in November at APEC. It wasn't a coincidence that Xi Jinping decided to speak to business leaders for his big event. He could have chosen any audience, and he chose to speak to American business leaders, undoubtedly part of the charm offensive to which charm campaign to which Terry refers. And I think we can expect that to continue in Beijing, and hopefully with some of the pressure off in a second term of Trump or second term of Biden, we'll find the leaders, thinking longer term and looking to, win the strategic competition, undoubtedly, but understanding, as you've said, Brendan, it takes two to tango. It sets up very well that America has a strong interest in Chinese economic success, and China has a strong interest in American economic success. That's where the policies are formed. Both sides keep their eye on security issues, and there is a competition for primacy, if you will, with regard to power and security. But they need each other for economic development. America needs China because of the integral part it plays in global supply chains, and as Terry has mentioned, because of its increasing importance as a market, not just for agricultural goods, but for other American products. And of course, China needs American economic success because Americans, of course, are the most powerful consumers in the world.
Yeah, maybe Terry, just with your experience, I mean, when these U.S. executives that we've seen, when they come to China, would they come and visit you? And maybe
Yes.
how much?
Well, of course, COVID really impacted that.
That's a good point.
Before COVID, we had a tremendous amount of American visitors. And of course, we have American Chamber of Commerce in Beijing and Shanghai and Chengdu and many locations in China. And if you look back over the last 3 decades, a lot of what has happened in China has been financed by American investments. And so I think the Xi Jinping recognizes that he needs that. He needs those American and international investors to invest in China. So if the rhetoric gets too hot and people are afraid to invest in China, that hurts the Chinese economy. And so I think he is keenly aware of that. That's why I think he came to San Francisco. That was part of the charm offensive, and meeting with American businesses was an important part of that. I think the challenge is getting the long established larger companies are doing well in China, but because of the rhetoric and because of some of the other actions that the Chinese have taken, the spy balloon and some of the other things that have happened, the Wolf Warrior comments and stuff, has scared off some of the younger, newer companies from investing in China. And I think Xi Jinping understands that that's critically important to his country's future as well.
Yeah, they need us as much as we need them. And
exactly, that's exactly right. We're interdependent, and American consumers appreciate the quality and affordability of Chinese consumer goods. The Chinese consumers appreciate the quality and reliability and affordability of American, especially agricultural goods, but some of the other things as well.
And I would add, Brendan, that U.S.-China relations does not happen in a vacuum. The other countries, whether they be Southeast Asia or Northeast Asia or elsewhere in the world, including Europe, they want calm waters across the Pacific. Everyone's interested in stability, and everyone's interested in global economic growth, the rising tide lifting, all boats, if you will. So at these meetings, or in the press, or as they're lobbied, if you will, or visited by by multinational companies, they hear a very consistent refrain, and that is, we all favor stability. And that should push either Biden or Trump towards some sort of a deal, if you will, that sort of governs the strategic competition, if you will, reframes the rules of the road so as to allow the Chinese economy to flourish and the American economy to flourish in one global economy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and certainly, I mean, that's one area where Taiwan has been so front and center. But I don't think we should anticipate any major policy changes from a second term Biden or second Trump. I mean, it feels like there's a real vested interest from the U.S. side. Obviously, a high dependency on Taiwan semiconductor, but we wouldn't expect any major changes from either of the candidates in a second term.
Yeah, I think now that we've moved through the Taiwanese elections, and of course, there was rhetoric coming from Beijing in anticipation of those elections, and even in the week or two after the elections, I think we can expect the status quo to continue. Taiwan is a very challenging problem for which the answer may just be the status quo. I know that Secretary Austin, in his comments at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore 2 or 3 weeks ago, was asked directly about Taiwan. The Biden administration has been crystal clear that they have no interest in changing the status quo. They're urging Taiwan not to do anything that would impact the status quo. That would continue in a second term. And I'll let Terry speak to his experience in the Trump administration, but there's every indication that the Trump administration will follow the same policy.
I would agree. I think that obviously Xi Jinping has, in his own rhetoric, indicated that he wants Taiwan under Beijing rule, and he probably would like to see that happen on his watch. However, I don't think the Chinese want to pay a big price for that. They would like that to happen peacefully. It's not going to happen peacefully because the Taiwanese people don't want to be under Beijing's rule. They saw what happened with Hong Kong. So it's going to continue to be a challenge. And certainly we've seen when Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan and other American officials have gone there, or Taiwanese officials have come here, it's caused China to do some provocative things. But hopefully that situation will remain the status quo. And again, the Chinese understand the importance of protecting that chip making business that is headquartered in Taiwan, and just as much as we do.
Yeah, the Silicon Shield should continue to protect Taiwan. I think this is an example, Brendan, where the pressure being off in a second term, whether it be Trump or Biden, I think it augurs well for, again, calm waters across the Taiwan Strait. Neither president will have, I think, a lot of pressure to, satisfy the urge to a demagogue, if you will, or to come with strong rhetoric on Taiwan, but rather to step back, maintain the status quo, and work on a bigger U.S.-China deal.
Yep.
Even though Taiwan is not nearly as big as mainland China, it is also an important trading partner with the United States. And so I think we really want to maintain both the trade with China and also with Taiwan.
Yep. Yeah, and certainly, my time in Taiwan, people wanted the status quo and, very strong trade relationships on the U.S. side and also the China side and broader Asia. And it's just kind of, leave things lie. And, one question we got from the audience, and again, if you have some questions for both Ambassador Branstad and Ambassador Adelman, please, you can use the QA button if you're joining us on Zoom, or simply email us at info@KraneShares. But one of the questions is surrounding TikTok, and I think in general, social media has been a little bit of an area where the technologies move so rapidly, and the regulation maybe hasn't quite kept up with it. But the Chinese roots of Taiwan, but we've seen kind of a change in opinion about TikTok from President Trump, but at the same time, doesn't feel like TikTok has a lot of friends in Washington, D.C. And I would point out that's despite the U.S. ownership of the parent ByteDance. But just for our friend Colin, just kind of curious if any thoughts around what will happen with a TikTok under either of these regimes.
Well, of course, the legislation was passed by the Congress, signed by President Biden, that says that the Chinese have to divest of TikTok within a year. Now, that's not till after this election, and of course, it's being challenged in the courts. So how that's going to end up is anybody's question. But both Biden and Trump have now done some advertising on TikTok, because how important that is to young people get their news from TikTok. A lot of people my age don't like that, but it is a fact of life. And I know that's true with my grandchildren. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens. And I'm not sure where the courts are going to come down on this or where it goes, but it's a very hot issue. And it was a very strong bipartisan vote to say that the ownership of TikTok needs to be transferred. And of course, the Chinese have reacted very negatively to that.
Look, the penetration of TikTok in America is profound. I think there's 180 million users who have downloaded and regularly use the TikTok app. So, I've said in other on other panels that there's not going to be a day on which the TikTok application is disabled on American devices. That would upset too many American consumers, including some in my home. It's interesting, the legislation that passed, the divestment legislation to which Terry refers, was part of a log rolling legislative package, if you will. It included the aid to Ukraine and aid to Israel in connection with the wars. So those three big issues were wrapped up into one bundle, which is how the leaders in Congress, Speaker Johnson, was able to achieve this bipartisan vote. I think if they were separated out, the TikTok bill would have had a little rougher ride, if you will, in the Congress. I think there'll be a resolution. I don't know what it will be. It may be aided, if you will, by some judicial action. But I would expect the TikTok journey is far from over, and the next stop for TikTok will be some sort of compromise that allows it to remain active and available to American consumers. And I think it is ironic, as Terry has mentioned, that all the campaigns up and down the ballot, not just the presidential campaigns, are using TikTok, as are many American small businesses using TikTok as their primary marketing channel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so another question we got from the audience was around, China's continued economic involvement, not just with the United States, but with broader ASEAN as well as the BRIC countries. And is this China trying to create a wedge between the U.S. and some of these other countries, or is this just them going about their business? We've seen the Saudis and Chinese government do a deal. Where now they're actually buying Saudi oil in renminbi. But is this a competition of ideologies or simply going about doing business?
Well, ever since Xi Jinping came to power, he started the Belt and Road Initiative, and that has been a tremendous, expensive undertaking to try to build friendships around the world, in Europe, in Africa, even in South America. So I don't think, and some of it has been well received and some of it has not, because it's many of these countries have ended up with significant debt and even turned over some harbors and things like that to the Chinese. So it's been a kind of a mixed bag, but it's been a very huge, expensive investment. But it does show that China is a very wealthy, developed country. They still like to claim that they're just a developing country, but they're very rich and very willing to spend resources to try to build friends around the world.
Yeah, look, Brendan, a generation ago now, Bob Zoellick famously implored China to be a responsible stakeholder in international relations. And maybe there was some reluctance 30 years ago, but increasingly China is strong on the world stage, promoting its own interests in its international relations. We see, for example, its active diplomacy in the Middle East, its active diplomacy with regard to Russia. And of course, as Terry has mentioned, it's very active and very strategic policies with regard to foreign markets and foreign direct investment. The Belt Road Initiative has had some issues in its execution, but nonetheless, I think, stands for China's determination to have a very muscular foreign policy that includes use of its economic strength.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I know we've had a few questions just around kind of the stock markets, both U.S. and China, which we won't put on your plate. But if those questions can be directed to info@KraneShares.com, we'll definitely get back to you as we approach the hour. Just Ambassador Branstad, Ambassador Adelman, kind of maybe last thoughts. My takeaway is, yes, there's going to be a lot of political rhetoric, campaign rhetoric. It's not unlikely to be actual economic or policy reality. And, we have to take a little bit of a grain of salt about politicians trying to get themselves reelected at, really any cost. And, more likely the second term for most presidents has been about building that legacy and expanding on the first Trump deal, or for Biden pivoting to accomplishing a deal with China. Just maybe, give each of you the last word here on your anticipation from the campaign. What should investors expect, for what should they downplay, and there's potential second terms?
Well, I think one of the big differences is their approach towards regulation. Trump says he wants to go back to deregulating. In his first term, he did a lot of deregulating, and I think along with the tax cuts, it made a big difference. And that's the taxes and regulations, I think, are a big issue in this election. The two biggest issues, I think, are economic inflation and the cost of living for American consumers, and then the border. And the border situation, he's done a recent executive order. It hasn't made any difference. And I think Americans are very upset about the influx of foreigners, even Chinese, pouring across our southern border. And I think that's caused a lot of people living all over the world, all over the United States, to be concerned about that issue. Even it looks like it was an issue in the European elections recently as well.
Brendan, I think it's important to consider U.S.-China policy on a continuum. Going back to the Obama-Biden first term, there was a strong interest in a deep engagement between Beijing and Washington. By the time the second Obama term came around, there was greater tension. In Trump's presidency, there was a direct confrontation between the United States and China, and that has gradually become, during this Biden presidency, this idea of a strategic competition with a solid and stable floor under it. It's going to be an extremely close election again. We may not even know the results of the election the day after Election Day. But I think for investors, it's safe to say that strategic competition will continue regardless of whether it's a Trump or a Biden second term. The pressure will be off either administration because they won't be seeking re-election for obvious reasons, and both presidents, or either president, will be looking to make their mark on international relations. And that's where I think there will be a difference. I think Trump will be looking for a big, grand deal to make his mark. And don't be surprised if some sort of American proposed settlement of the Russia-Ukraine war is not part of that grand bargain. Whereas Biden, I think, will be more tactical, as I've said, trying to navigate the issues rather than as part of one big package, rather on a case-by-case basis. The pressure will be on both men, or either man, to make their mark, but the pressure of a political campaign and hot rhetoric will be up. Will be off. That being said, I think the next 3 months running up to Election Day is going to be a little bit of a wild ride. I think the rhetoric is going to be very hot with U.S.-China relations near the top of the list. We can expect to hear a lot of very hawkish rhetoric towards China. But on the day after the election, I think either administration will benefit from the floor that's underneath the relationship. the resumption of military to military communication at the highest level, and the interest each country has in each other's economic success for growth of the global economy.
Well, thank you again, and we're looking forward to you. We'll have to do this again, maybe a little bit closer to the election, get an update. And but certainly, thank you both for your time. And again, for some of the questions related to the market and what's happening in terms of China's economy, please email us at info@KraneShares.com, and we'll definitely get back to you. But thank you both for your time. Thank you, Ambassador Branstad, Ambassador Adelman.
Thank you, Brendan. Thank you.